Hi, I'm Satyen Sangani, and I'm one of the founders and the CEO of a company called Alation. I'm also your host for this podcast on data culture. Today I have with me my guest, Deb Seys. Deb is somebody who I've known for a long time and somebody who I admire with a ton of grace, and I think many of you will see that today. Deb, do you mind if I ask you to introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. Deb Seys here. I am a longtime Alation fan, one of the earliest customers, and currently now working as the Director for Learning and Communities at Alation. And I'm a librarian by profession and training, and have been fortunate enough to take that career through a variety of positions over the last couple of decades, watching everything that's come to fruition with a product like Alation. So very happy to be here and talking with you, Satyen.
Being a librarian and I guess then transitioning over to a product like Alation with his enterprise software in the data and analytics world kind of seem related, but maybe only in a small way. Like, how did that thread get from that starting point to where you are today?
I was going to be a catalog librarian. I was going to be a systems behind the scenes type librarian where we cataloged the collection and managed how people were going to be able to find things and use the library catalog. And then very early on, I got introduced to early systems, library systems, and took a right turn from libraries into developing the systems that libraries use to manage their catalogs. And it was a short jump from there to other kinds of information management, employee portals, search engines, and all of that was taking off at that stage in my career. So like at Hewlett-Packard, I was part of the team that launched their first employee portal. At Kaiser, we had an intranet search engine that we implemented to try and tease out all the content hidden in the corners of these enterprise networks. And then I went to eBay to consult on a data portal. So it was sort of, information to information on the web to how do you find it to how do you put it away so people can find it again. And that was Max years and years ago. The Metrics and Analytics Exchange was kind of like Yahoo for reporting.
So I guess the core problem is, how do you find information? What made you passionate about that, and what made you interested in...
Actually, I was more interested. It's funny. I was actually more interested in how you put it away. Because if you don't put it away right, you'll never find it. So I was really interested in that problem of describing and making things. At some point, there was this notion of making things self-describing so that they could sit there all in fragmented pieces. Things like that sort of came alive for me. So as we were thinking about BI reporting, business intelligence reporting, or bits and pieces of data or release notes, I was interested in what you needed to do in order to be able to put it away. Kind of like a big garage. If you just keep throwing stuff into the garage, you'll never find it again. So it's really important which box you put it in.
Because I'm thinking of you as this kind of Marie Kondo for
right.
for data.
Right. Well, there were people already working in that space who thought they were doing that job, right? So the DBAs thought they were modeling things properly. The custodians thought they were titling things properly and organizing the tables and adding to the tables in a way that would make them usable. And then the analysts worked sort of hand in hand with what I call the custodians, the ETL engineers, or the people at eBay that were writing the release notes if they made changes to a table. They all thought they were doing that job, but in fact, they actually weren't. There was a space in there for what you might think of as information architecture, or the ability to understand what really needed to be wrapped around that work they were doing in order to actually make it usable and discoverable.
That's kind of an interesting observation, right? Because there's all of these people whose job it is to move data around and to build these data models, and they're reasonably technical, but they're thoughtful about their work. And here you are coming along and saying they think they're doing a job and they're not doing that. That seems odd. Like, what is it that they weren't doing? Like, how did they not do their jobs?
Well, one of the first things I started doing at eBay when I joined, and we were Metrics and Analytics Exchange, and then we moved to building a tool called Data Hub that I think you remember. For example, there was a requirement that if there was a change to a table, somebody had to write up a release note. And so some ETL engineer would write up some description of the added column to a table, or they were deprecating something. And it was my responsibility. Somebody found out that I had a lit writing undergraduate degree, and they told me, okay, you do the release notes. And so I'd have to spend time interviewing to figure out what the impact of that change was, why they'd done the change in the first place, how best to describe it in business language so that it wasn't just a technical change, but it was had a business impact to it. And that was the piece that I'm sort of talking about, that there was that gap between the work that these folks were doing to kind of carefully build and deliver this data warehouse and the understanding of the people down the road who had to use it. And the analysts filled that gap in their own understanding of the data, and so they could adapt to those changes. But if you wanted someone who wasn't sort of intimately in lockstep with that other technical folks, then you'd be lost. And so in order to be able to open up the data to a broader population, you had to somehow figure out how to describe that business understanding and the down the road real impact, meaningful impact of whatever that change was. And so it started with just change and then became sort of a bigger thing around usage and activity and value and so forth. And Alation kind of brought that bigger picture, because when we made it public on the data catalog, and you didn't have to have some, insider's understanding of what IP address you needed to use to log into some particular part of the data warehouse. Once it became more easily available that way, you had to make the understanding more easily available as well.
Yeah, it's funny when I think about our first meeting. Do you remember our first meeting?
I do. I remember what the conference room looked like.
Yeah, me too. Do you remember what it was? Do you remember what you said when like you first saw the demo of Alation?
What I remember thinking, I don't know, maybe I said it out loud, but I remember thinking this is going to blow everything out of the water.
Well, I think you said something like, I see my career dissipation light blinking because this thing was going to replace me. And I started laughing because I thought to myself, well, if we're building this product, this thing, like what I want it to be is the software personification of Deb. Where, I always thought about this idea of sort of this helpful research librarian who would, if you had a question, would be able to figure out what ideas or bits of information might be able to help you. And what's interesting is that, somewhat similarly, you're sort of saying like these people, these engineers are building all of this information, right? They're building all of this data, they're building these data models, and yet, somebody needs to, and these analysts have a question, but somebody needs to marry these two people together. Yeah. But sometimes do you always know how do you know what the analysts are looking for, and how do you know to categorize it in a way that they can consume it?
So if you think about librarianship as a profession, and it's one of the ways I try to explain it is that the same book, let's say you get a book on medical ethics. If you were to put that book into a medical library, it would end up in the ethics section. But if you were to put that book in a general library, it would end up in the medicine section. And so you have to kind of think of the whole and the piece at the same time. And the reason that piece ends up in the whole in two different places is the purpose of the collection and the people who are going to use it. And so that's why when you think about Alation as it's installed and implemented at different companies and their different culture and their different sense of who they are and their meaning and their purpose and their business outcome, they make quite different decisions about how to implement different features. And that's why, because one's a financial company, one's a e-commerce, has a product that consumers are using, or maybe it's just insiders inside the enterprise. And so the decisions about how to manage the collection or how to answer a question are very contextual to audience, the content you have, and the purpose you're trying to. There isn't any objective way to catalog anything, really.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty hard concept, right? So what you're saying is that the problem or the types of information almost, like there isn't a single model for describing all of this information, which is really hard, right? Because people, who buy this software often are like, oh, there's like a single way to do this, and how do you do this, and what's the answer, and what do you tell them?
It's this interpretation of best practices, and people always want example of the way to do it. I actually think for a long time I was involved, sort of thinking around knowledge management and we should catalog all these ways in which people did it successfully. But I actually think there's a lot more learning to find out, when people kind of attempted to do something and found out that didn't work. I think there's actually a lot of rich learning from wrong practices, not just best practices. But I think it's a difficult problem, and I think that's why the Alation customer community became really important, and for people to be able to discuss those kinds of potentially confusing questions or questions where they have multiple options. I think that it's not just that you have one feature, which way to implement it, but with Alation now becoming more mature as a product, you actually may have a business problem or some particular discovery issue that you want to solve or optimize for, and you may have 3 different ways to do it on Alation. Maybe you want a glossary, maybe you want an article, parent-child relationship, maybe you want to use a catalog set. And so we offer our customers this toolbox of ways to do stuff. Helping them figure out what's the right one for them is really our professional services team, for example. They really think a lot about that. That's why it's not just a simple answer often for customers.
So I guess maybe I'll say 2 things. I think the first is that, this podcast is totally intended for people who are doing the work anywhere, whether they're customers of Alation or not. And I guess in that sense, like, what is the hard part of doing this work? I mean, you've been in this job, and it seems like it's a fairly obvious thing to try to organize information. Probably everybody would love to do it. Like, why isn't everybody doing this? Why isn't this always successful? Like, as you've done all of this work, what's hard about describing all of this information?
I can think of 2 or 3 answers. One answer is that knowledge management or information architecture or user experience, they're all sort of terms that touch in various ways on what we're talking about, is that it's hard to prove value. It's hard to say to somebody, if you put the work in, you'll get the value out later. Knowledge management is historically very difficult to prove value. You can say we saved somebody 3 minutes, and that 3 minutes cost you so much at a company, and therefore you've saved, 17 hours over 2 weeks, and that's that much pay. But that, to me, has never been a satisfying, real value. The the work that we did around query reuse, if you remember the graduate student from Kellogg that started looking at how queries could be reused on Alation, for example, was one of the first times that I actually saw real, true value proof of if you actually catalog queries and make them available to other people, what can they do with them? What can they learn from them? What kind of business outcome value can you get from them? So that's one thing. The other thing is that people historically think of these kinds of activities as one and done. And kicking them off is the least of the work. It's figuring out how to keep that engine going, how to maintain it, how to keep things up to date, how to easily create what I call this trail of behavior that people leave behind them. So capturing knowledge has always historically been very difficult, getting people to contribute what they know to some shared knowledge base.
Yeah. I think that, to me, I mean, I think that there's sort of an intuition that people have that it may or may not be valuable, or even sometimes a belief. But often this idea that there's like, I'm going to do this once, and there's going to be a right answer, and then once I'm done with the right answer, I've never have to do this again. I mean, that to me is it's almost there's a rigidity to that mindset, but there's also a fundamental belief that there is one truth. And that I always find interesting. How do you, when you meet those people who are, because you did the work, inside of a fairly large company, right? You've done it at HP, you've done it at eBay, you've done it at Kaiser. As you've done that work, what happens when you meet those people? How do you talk to them? How do you convince them otherwise?
One of the questions I thought about was change management. I think a lot of what happens when we're trying to make a change or have a company become sort of a data culture company is that I don't think you actually lead change. You listen for opportunities. In other words, I think people are doing the work anyway. Let's say you're inside a company. Somebody's got to get their job done. The analyst has to get their job done. They're doing the work anyway. The work my work is to listen to what they're doing, listen to how they're trying to get there, and become part of that process. And so while somebody's I know it's not a great metaphor, but, somebody's trying to nail in, using a rock for a hammer. And you don't say to them, come over here and go do this other work. You sort of slide in a real hammer and you say, I know you're trying to get that thing into the wood, and here's a tool that'll really help you do what you're already trying to do. And so when I was going out to introduce people, or when I go out to introduce people to new applications or new ways of doing things, the job is not to market to them. The job is to sort of listen to them, figure out what they're doing, and then look at what you have and say, how does it fit? How do I help them get to where they're already going? And then that becomes more of a partnership rather than you're not looking at each other face to face. You're looking at the work side by side.
And those are for the people who are trying to discover the information or find the information, right?
Yes.
So,
yeah.
and you've mentioned that a couple of times. You said sort of in one sense. No, go ahead.
They're not trying to discover the information for just the sake of discovering it. They need the information to get something done, and I think that's the piece we always forget. And I had a mentor at HP years ago, and at that time there was, again, this sort of knowledge management holy grail, and it was like, let's get the right information to the right person at the right time. And her answer was, so what? Then what do? You've given them the right information. They're actually not just sitting there looking for the information. They're actually trying to get some business work done.
When you talked a little bit about this idea of sort of failed experiments, and you sort of said, I really want to find out what people are trying to do, where they're failing, because there's a lot more to learn from that than when they're succeeding, right? And on some level, what you're basically saying is people have work that they want to get done. They're going along and doing their day job. And, the most successful effort for me is not having epistemological conversation about taxonomies and how to folder things and file things and categorize things, but instead to just help them do their job better.
Yes, exactly.
Which totally makes sense for the people consuming the information. But like, what about all these people who are, sitting there, like, the IT person who is like, they're convinced that this model is the one model to rule them all, or somebody who's in legal, for example, or perhaps in governance who's sort of saying, oh, well, I know that there's a single way to, build these terms. Like, how do you think about that? And how do you speak to them? Because often, there is a interest in sort of structure and perhaps maybe even rigidity.
What your question makes me think of, Satyen, is the difference between the executive view of why they might want to build some kind of an information discovery tool for the people at their company. They're thinking about a particular pain point from the top down. They're thinking of sort of broad company objectives, and they want to influence their employees to be more data literate or more data driven. And actually, what I find is that there's an entirely different set of pain points from the bottom up, or from an individual person, as they're experiencing maybe fragmented information silos, or nobody's capturing information, or I can't find what I'm looking for when I need it in order to get my job done. And those two, it depends. A company may decide to implement something because they have some initiative, and I'm recalling a broad initiative that the chief technology officer at eBay implemented called the Self-Service Analytics Initiative. And that was designed to drive data usage further out into the business, to get people who were product managers and who relied on data analysts to give them the data they needed in order to make their decisions. The CTO wanted all of those PMs and business people to be able to gather and create their own data. Whereas the business people were perfectly happy to let the data analysts do all their work. So that driving of that initiative from the top down was quite different than the problems that the data analysts were experiencing, or the PMs who couldn't put their hands on the latest data, or didn't understand that actually they had to tool the data capture into the product they were designing so that they could get the data out. And because they lacked that understanding, they weren't getting the information out from usage of their new product feature in a way that they wanted. And so it's, again, this sense that I have that what data makes us do is think very small and very big at the same time. Lots of little pieces and the whole.
There's kind of this tension that I often find where, certainly the people who are in data infrastructure, who are in IT, who are trying to build these horizontal efforts, would like to build the perfect mousetrap, because they know, and we know, that there's so many different problems to which these things could be applied. And then on the other hand, there's all these folks who are just like, I have my job to do and I want to do my job more easily. And they're typically the people with the money. And they're typically the people that can fund these initiatives. And often what I find is that both of them sort of have to listen to the other. That, if you can't actually make the business initiative successful, you'll never get enough oxygen to do the often boil the ocean exercise of categorizing all of the information. But on the other hand, if you don't build any of the infrastructure, all of the initiatives will be totally disparate, tactical, and you'll never get any advantage from doing any of them. So I find that tension to be really interesting and like sort of a constant theme in almost every one of these projects. And it's easy to get lost often, I find. So, maybe, as you think about this, so you've done this work for a while, and maybe let's bring this back to sort of, the individuals and the people. Like, what are some of the hardest problems? Like, if you think through your career, what are some of the stories of the hardest problems you've seen addressed, and, the biggest success and maybe the biggest failures when you've addressed those problems?
I think the biggest success that I've seen, just for me personally, was the work that I did with the graduate student at Kellogg School of Business, where what I'd seen in watching usage of Alation at eBay was this increase in people cloning queries and running them and editing them. And because you can, if you've somehow persuaded a subject matter expert to write a bunch of pages in your wiki or document their knowledge around some piece of the data, and you can tell them, well, your page has been viewed 16 times. That's great. But what did they do after they read it? Was it really valuable to them? Did they read it and go, so what? Did they, you don't get that sort of second step.
So let me just back up, because there might be some people listening to this podcast who don't even know what a database was or don't know what a database query is. So and I'd actually, even maybe at the time of starting the company or maybe not very long before, had no idea what a database. So what's a query?
It's a question you ask of the data. So you have terabytes, petabytes of data that you've gathered, tables with hundreds of thousands of rows of data gathered from activity on your website, for example. And you ask a question of the data, and you get an answer back in the form of, some people are quite, the analysts are quite logistically experienced in asking very complicated questions. And their queries are programmatic and difficult to read. They mention data assets. They go through some complicated programmatic logic to filter out certain things that don't matter, zero in on things that do, and get a result set to try and begin to answer a question that they need in order to make a decision, let's say.
And just to ground this, what's an example of a query in that context?
Well, at eBay, it might be something like, and experimental, eBay did a lot of A/B testing, for example. That was a huge, rich source of data. And so A/B testing means that it wasn't always this clear cut. It was quite complicated. But let's say half of the customers would see a blue call to action button in the upper right-hand corner of a page, and half the customers would see a yellow button down in the lower left-hand corner of the page. And the product manager who was designing that page wanted to know which one people responded to more often. And they wanted to know which one people responded to more often when the page they were looking at was a kitchen product or a sporting goods product. Maybe sporting goods, yellow button, got a better result. Kitchen products, blue button, upper right-hand corner, or maybe the demographics. And the tables and data at eBay was massive, was old, was moving all the time. And so writing a query that might look at a table with millions of rows and 1,000 columns might require that you filter out just this year's data, just the demographics of a user between 20 and 35, just the products that appear on what we call sports pages, and just the button in the upper right or left-hand corner. And so you can imagine that kind of logic to pull just that set of data, and then to tell them they clicked on the button. And therefore, the product manager might make some decision to actually go to production with the blue button in the upper right-hand corner for sporting goods.
Got it. So this person is trying to answer a question about some behaviors on the website that they're managing. And all of a sudden, there's a lot of complexity around all of that human behavior, because people who like kitchens might want green buttons, and people who like sporting goods might like blue buttons, and you need to figure out the differences, and maybe that's even dimensioned by time. Okay, so in that world, how do people figure out, so you said there's this idea of a wiki page, and how would that be different from this idea of a query?
That's the really fascinating part, is that actually if you read the logic of a query, it tells you a great deal. It tells you, first of all, which data assets hold the information that you're looking for. And that's not always obvious. So, for example, at large companies, often the same bit of data is repeated across different tables over different time. Sometimes tables themselves or data assets are deprecated, or, in other words, retired or replaced or enhanced. And so it can be very complicated to figure out where the answer to your question might be. And if you read a successful query, it can reveal a lot about the data landscape. So that's one piece of it. And then we encouraged people, and often this was the other thing, because queries were public bits of knowledge, often many people who were, I could use the word proud, or were knew that what they had done was a useful piece of knowledge, would comment it or describe it or title it, because they had the opportunity to do so in this environment. And so there was sort of a whole constellation of context around this query. Who wrote it? When was it run? Which assets was it run against? What description the person who wrote it gave to it, what title they gave. And so all of that context, it's kind of like looking, if you're searching for, the other day I bought something, I wanted to exercise my hands, and there are like thousands of little hand exercise toolkits you could buy. But I used a bunch of context, reviews that other people might have written, how recently it was, this product was made available, which websites actually stocked it. That gave me some lift to the quality of it. So all of that, kind of what might seem at first is sort of trivial context, it accrues into some larger set of pointers that say, yeah, that's the right way to go.
Right. So you have all these queries, and we started all of this because there was this Northwestern study about people's behaviors. And what did that study prove with all of these queries? And how is that different from sort of the wikified world that you were talking about, which seemed like an earlier generation?
The key to it was that they weren't just reusing them, they were learning from them. So that was because if you think about somebody reading a wiki page and you ask the question, 16 people have viewed this so many times, you don't really know what they've done out of it, because the next step that they take is a black box to you, because they've taken their next step somewhere else. In other words, they've maybe read something, and then they've gone and done their work. And so if you think about what used to happen with the citation index on research papers, if someone wrote a paper and then the next person wrote another paper and cited something from that paper, you could see that
there's a lineage of knowledge.
There's a lineage of that knowledge. Yeah,
right.
Thank you. And so you could see that this person built on the shoulders of this first piece. And so if you think about someone cloning and editing and rerunning successfully a query, you can make that same kind of judgment call like you would from a citation, that the next step was a learned step, was a absorption of what was learned there, a cloning, an editing, and a successful run.
And so this study sort of proved that there were sort of incremental bits of knowledge being built upon the core of what existed in the...
Yes, and because we had that trail, we could do a similar thing like citation analysis to see that this next, if a query represents knowledge, and you can assume that it does, because they take a great deal of work to write and run successfully, and then you assume that someone who read and referenced and found it useful enough to make a copy and then edit and run and reference, you can make a similar. We started out by saying, what have I considered to be a success or learned from data. To me, that was just absolutely fascinating to see the evidence of that in some concrete way. And I think the interesting thing is that, particularly about Alation again, is that it is both a reference tool and a action tool at the same time. And many of the old, like the metrics and analytics exchange I worked on, or Data Hub, these were reference portals. Maybe the next generation from just documenting something on a wiki, but you would read and learn from it, but go off and do your work somewhere else. And that was that disconnect, which is connected.
Right. Because going back to your original point, sort of the idea that there is sort of this fixed way of categorizing or organizing or describing things, on some level, that premise is false. And so this notion that sort of says, hey, like we, by doing the work that we're doing, are building knowledge, but also building description of the knowledge that we have, automatically citing things and making those descriptions more valid, that evolutionary system is actually something that was, that you were able to prove.
Yes, it becomes sort of I think that's the other thing. If we go back to thinking about what is the persuasion of somebody, why maintaining a knowledge catalog is hard, is that it's a living, breathing thing. Some of the language from older librarianship talks about weeding and grooming the collection. Library collections, for example, book collections don't ever stay the same. People are constantly, looking through the collection. Is it still being used? Does it need to be upgraded? Is there a new edition? Do we need to add a whole bunch of women's lib books to home economics, or does it belong in its own category somewhere? Librarians think a lot about cataloging the world's knowledge, and what does that mean to say, as new things come up, how do you place them into an existing collection, create the relationships? And that happens in a natural way if you're actually working, if you're actually doing something with it, accomplishing that business objective that I keep going back to. You create that trail of individual behavior, but you also create a trail of how the collection is evolving itself and changing over time, how the data catalog is. Some table that was very heavily used before is now deprecated in favor of the new one.
Right. And so sometimes even at the limit, though, those new things also help you or even cause you to rethink how you organized things in the past.
Yes.
And so that's a success. What about the failures? I would imagine
Never had any, Satyen. I didn't have any failures at all that I can remember. No, I'm sure I had plenty, but for some reason, the one that keeps popping in my head right now that I think is interesting to talk about is we bring a lot of preconceived notions to reporting and data and the production of metrics. And one of the things about democratizing access to data is that you get a lot more opinions about it. And if you also democratize how you catalog assets, you could potentially not be misled by them. And one example I can think of that I think is just a great example has to do with the introduction of a better way of managing thumbnails on eBay product pages. So when a seller wanted to post something to an eBay listing, they were given the opportunity to purchase a certain number of images that they could upload with that listing to make it more attractive. At some point, eBay decided to make that free for a certain number of images because they realized how important the images were. And there was a whole effort to make the display of the images better, smaller, sharper, more easily browsable. And there was a significant metric prior to that effort that said that people would spend a great deal of time browsing a results page. So I'd search for hand exercisers, and I'd see this list. And the metric wanted people to spend a lot of time on that page. And so a high number in that metric was a success. But what happened when they improved the images was that suddenly people weren't spending a lot of time on that page at all. And some key metric was going down. And there was an uproar about the release of these new images was causing this metric to go down, and it was awful, and they have to pull back on it. We don't know what's going on. But actually, when they looked further, what they found was that people were actually clicking through because they were finding what they were looking for really quickly, and that actually what they needed to look at was the conversion, the shopping cart conversion metric, which they hadn't connected to the view the results page metric. And so this complexity of it's sort of an old story, but the complexity of the connection of these metrics showed that actually less time on that page was good. And the connection of, viewing that thumbnail, getting to the shopping cart, and converting was actually the metric that they wanted to be looking at.
Yeah,
So,
which funnily enough seems like another example of kind of rigidity, right? Because there might be people whose jobs depended on driving engagement.
yes.
And so, this was catastrophic for them because people were not engaged as measured by time spent on page.
Right.
And all of a sudden you're sitting here, or not you, but like somebody,
Right.
improved the user's experience.
Right.
And the outcome got better,
Right.
but the intermediate metric didn't.
Right. And the understanding of the user experience needed to evolve.
Right. And so the insight moved somebody's cheese, as it were, like before. And so, on some level, it sounds like the hardest problem there was just that, you have to change people's mindsets and also kind of evolve in some way, like the actual exploration of data in many cases changes what people do and what they're focused on.
I think it's one of the most misunderstood things about data is that data is actually an accumulation of meaning, and that people actually tell stories with data. And the idea that data might be this sort of objective, hard thing that just sits there and reveals something is not at all true at all. The understanding of actually a lot of the work of, documenting metrics or documenting why we're capturing data into a table is a lot about what's important to a group of people. What's important to them, how do they define it, how do they agree on that definition, and then use that to actually tell a story or make a decision.
Right. I mean, it's there's that great quote that journalism is the first cut at history. It's sort of like, the analytic is, on a fresh set of data might be the first cut, but there may be many cuts in the future that might view things differently. So Deb, you've talked a lot about, this example with eBay where you've got all of the sophistication and measurability and data coming out of these websites where people are doing this, that, and the other. But how has that evolved? Like, how has that changed over time? And you've been in places like Kaiser and HP. In this core work of information retrieval, what's been different today than maybe yesterday, and how things changed?
Yeah, at Hewlett-Packard, there was just the beginning of this kind of an acknowledgement that someone over here might want to know what someone over there is doing or learn from it. And so the whole idea of connecting what at the time was just this early understanding of an intranet. People don't even use that term anymore because now they're sort of internal and out. But it was quite a way of thinking about, because people, you think about a company, people have meetings, there are orgs and teams, and they have relationships and processes, and the idea of, just being able to log into an employee portal and do a quick search and find out that this other team is working on some other initiative, that was a really new idea. And I don't think anybody, at the time that the connections were made, there was just an interest in making the connections, just kind of a pure scientific research. What would happen if we connected all of this and made it searchable? And so, for example, at Kaiser, one of the things I I was responsible for was the internal search engine. And that search engine was connected to the employee portal. And at Kaiser, that was because they're a healthcare organization, things were quite locked down and very rigorous, very process-oriented. And one of the funny things was that they already had a search engine. They'd already gone through the brute force of deciding how to index it. And now that we were going to purchase and implement a brand new one. And you would think that would be easier, just swapping out one technology for another. But it was actually a huge process of mapping the meaning of one field or one search results display to how this new search engine would do it. And so even the application of what might seem to be a very straightforward technology, one search engine for another, was actually a really meaningful activity of what's the content, which fields do we index, what do we call those fields, which ones appear in the search result or don't. What decision did we make 2 years ago that doesn't seem like such a good decision now? Could we improve it? And that activity was really interesting because the people I was working with sort of at the ground level had lots of opinions about it. And then, of course, we'd run all that design by the executives, and they would question everything and change it. And that's a whole other story. But
they would question the design principles, or they would question the design principles because there's lots of power in that, right? There's a lot of power.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to say.
In sort of being the censor,
right?
Or
right.
Or if you're
right,
maybe being more generous, the librarian.
Right. What I remember, and I for the life of me, I can't remember the exact field, but there was a big argument about a field that we wanted to have appear in the search results because we thought it'd be a really meaningful way for people to scan quickly and find what they're looking for. And the executives didn't want it. I think it was which team had written the result page, like which team owned it or had written it. And I think what that revealed was that actually most of the work was being done by a different team, and this team wanted to own it. So they didn't want everybody to know that actually all the work had been done, I don't know, by this other team. But it was a decision that was very focused on who owned information, which is also, as you can imagine, something that librarians bump up against all the time.
Yeah, which is, it's funny because people talk a lot about data silos, but often the reason for the silo isn't the inaccessibility of the system. It's the people who are
correct
effectively defining their careers around the system.
Correct.
Yeah.
Which is always where the request for workflows comes from. Almost nobody needs workflows except the people who want to retain control. The people who are actually trying to get work done have no interest in putting something through a workflow.
Is that true even in a regulatory context? There are some justifications for it,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, and I guess maybe, as you then think about those projects and the history around sort of what executives did or didn't do, imagine you're advising, as you actually in many cases do, a chief data officer who's getting into the realm of data culture and who's trying to figure out how to move their, teams forward. And famous article, well, I don't know if it's famous, a recent article came out and said that the life cycle of the job is less than 18 months. What would you tell them to do? What advice would you give them?
I know I may sound like a broken record, but I would ask them to return to what it is that the people that work for them actually do for a living. What do those people do for a living, and why would they not want those people to have everything at their disposal in order to get the job done? And if that involves a tool, like you would never say to somebody, well, I'll get you a computer next week. Just, try to do your job without this essential tool. And I guess I would turn it back on the executive to prove to me why somebody doesn't need it.
Okay. So think about how to apply data to the day-to-day lives of the people that they're there to ostensibly service.
Yes, that information or knowledge or data, whatever you want to call it at any given time, because it could be sort of slightly more one thing or the other at any given time, is essential for being intelligent, for sort of moving forward. You want someone to have the entire picture in front of them, and that picture is made up of information from the past, learnings, all those things those names that we give to information and knowledge and practice. The bigger and more detailed and rich picture we can give people, the better chance they have they have of making their way through that and getting to the other end successfully. It's like walking through a dark room or entering a garage with a bunch of paper boxes, none of which are labeled.
So, Deb, you mentioned this idea that often, coming back to this notion that sometimes the failures, sometimes when people are trying to look for something, but they get to a dead end, those are the questions that you those are the examples that you really learn from. And I found that to be true often as well, that often people have an idea in their heads, but they can't figure out how to pave the road or walk the road to get to the place where the data can answer the question for them. Do people just need to ask better questions? I mean, what's the learning there, and how do you think about approaching those problems when you see them?
When I was a undergraduate, I graduated with a lit writing degree, and I thought before I decided to go down the library route that I was going to teach writing. And one of the thoughts and the approach that we used at the time was not to sit down and begin writing, but to, particularly when you're trying to create an argument or an essay or something along those lines, rhetoric, if you don't exactly know what it is you're trying to say, you'll never write well. And that once you've decided what it is you actually have to say, the point you're trying to make, then writing actually comes quite naturally to most people. The difficulty in writing is not the difficulty of writing, it's the difficulty of knowing what it is the heck you're trying to say, or what your opinion is. And I would say that same thing happens with data. If you don't have a really good sense of what it is you're trying to find out, and it kind of boils down to that measure twice, cut once. The thought process is the measuring twice. The other thing I would say is that you kind of have to know, and this recalls for me an experience I had with a user experience researcher at eBay. You have to know the detail or the clarity or the granularity that you're seeking or that you're driving towards. So I was thinking about, like, you might tell somebody, I went on a date with this guy, he's got blue eyes. And my friend immediately would know, oh, blue eyes, I have a sense of what that is. But they're not going to ask me the hex color of the representation of his blue eyes. It was enough to just know he has blue eyes. But if I were painting the wall in my kitchen and I wanted it to be blue, I might actually know the paint color number, so that I would match exactly the blue in my living room with the blue I wanted to paint my kitchen. And so the detail or the specificity of what I'm looking for is really important in the context of what I'm trying to get done. communicate that I met somebody with blue eyes, or actually paint my wall a very, very specific color. And the example I have for this with data is this user experience researcher was trying to gather information to give one of her designers about some general design or interaction on the site. And I kept telling her, you're going to have to wait until Wednesday's batch runs to have the most up-to-date information or something like that. The table you're trying to use is not fully accurate or fully built out. And she was like, I don't care. She says, I just want to muck around a little bit and get some ideas. So it doesn't really matter to me that this table isn't fully loaded. And she said, don't worry about it. And actually I said, well, in that case, you could use this one. It's a month old, but it's a lot easier to use, and it won't take you, 4 hours to query.
Yeah, it's funny. In some ways, I find that between the first example of really having an intention or an idea or a motivation, on some level, contrast with that notion of play, where play and discovery. I mean, I often find that when I think I know something, and I think I know it really well, and then I sit down to write about it, and then I've got to pick exactly the words and exactly the arguments, and I've got to frame it in a particular way, and that ends up being its own discovery process where I learn almost based on just sort of tearing apart my own thinking.
Yes.
I think a lot of analytics is like that.
Yes.
But almost accepting that process, I find, is there's a little bit of sanity that can come to that, because otherwise, if you think you know the answer going in all the time, that can be hard.
Yes. Yeah. It's data scientists are, the whole process of creating data models and training sets, and that just takes that whole notion, sort of makes it three-dimensional. It's kind of, the difference between playing tic-tac-toe and that one that's kind of standing up three-dimensional sort of tic-tac-toe that kids play now, takes it into a whole other realm, that something here that I'm using is got its own meaning and three-dimensionality, and now I'm going to mix it up with this other idea I have, and then that's going to come out and give me some other result over here. It's kind of like a philosopher talking to a religion person, and anyway, I'm going nowhere with this.
But there's this idea that
argument.
the person is building and trying to set up a system of learning.
Yes.
And on some level, organizationally, you're trying to build organizations or communities of people that are optimized for learning. I mean, there's kind of that meta.
Yeah.
Two-level commonality there.
Yeah. I think that's really important. You were talking about compliance earlier, and how this sort of comes full circle to what I was saying about different companies have different reasons for being companies. And in some cases, it really does, that crystal clear clarity of data for compliance or regulatory purposes or personally identifiable information versus the kind of discovery or data modeling that somebody might do over in an e-commerce or in a more research-oriented organization, or like the game companies where they're really trying to design an experience. Those are quite different purposes for the data. Definitely different approaches to them.
So coming back to this idea of sort of data culture, I mean, that's what this podcast is about. We're trying to get more people to do more of this data culture stuff. How do you define data culture? What is data culture to you? What does it mean?
For me, it falls back again a little bit on that individual but the individual within the whole. And I think for me, data culture is about small actions repeated. And by that I mean culture is really relationships and meaning. And if you want to move a culture, you're actually doing a tipping point activity. And it's either sort of, it's kind of an influencer sort of activity where one person makes a move and maybe takes a few other people with them, and then some other person and those two people meet. And so I think you might define for yourself what kind of a culture you want, but you can't do that without thinking to yourself what kind of behavior you want, what kind of relationships you want people to have. Because culture, I think, is really dependent on one-to-one interactions, but repeated over and over again to create the whole.
So it's sort of driving shared behaviors and shared relationships.
Yes, yes.
And so in the context of data, what does that mean? Like, is that subjective and different for every institution, or is that the same for every institution? In your experience,
when we drove that self-service data analytics initiative, the most difficult part was that in order to use data, you remember I was saying that queries are questions of the data. And a lot of times people aren't used to thinking of their questions in a way that can be answered by data. And so that analyst mindset that can think in terms of asking a question of the data in a way that can be answered by data, that was the hardest change. And learning that is a practice of kind of apprenticeship to mastery. I think using data is a combination of art and science. Many of these PMs that we were talking to, often the answer they might have in their head was very similar to the answer they might get from the data, because they sort of already knew it. And what they were getting more was confirmation rather than sometimes something new, but often getting confirmation as well. And so that that process of getting them to think that way was like you might say that somebody would think in terms of being able to write music or ask a question in a mathematical way. That's similar to how people learn to use data, I think.
Yeah, I think it sounds like what you're saying is that there needs to be an impulse to try initially to answer a question that you might have, or a hypothesis that you might have, or an opinion that you might have, with a first thought that maybe I could be wrong, or maybe there's some data to confirm or deny that this is actually true.
Right.
Which is kind of an impulse of humility, right? I mean, you have to sort of, or at least there's a little bit of ego detachment from it.
Correct.
So maybe before we close, I know you're working on this idea of this data intelligence project, and it's something that you and my co-founder Aaron have been working on. Tell us a little bit about what this project's all about and what is it?
I've had a really fun opportunity to work with a very open-minded and wonderful professor over at University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. And it's the School of Information Studies, which is the kind of school that I graduated with my master's in library science a million years ago. And these are folks who are going out into the world to become a variety of professions associated with information management. And these days that includes data, includes things like cryptocurrency and data information security, and as well as systems like what I started out, managing a library system, and many people just going into traditional library profession. What we've been doing is providing them a platform to learn what they already need to learn, but to do it in a different environment, for example. And when I went to school for my degree, we were using things like LexisNexis, which is an online reference source, or using an example of a library system, or the large Library of Congress system. And so it's not unusual when you're learning a profession like that to have an application to practice your profession on. And so by providing them Alation to use, we're hoping that they see the opportunity for the kind of work that they might do already in a slightly different environment around data. So if one of the things that people who work in information studies do is they create a user experience. And we're maybe getting them to think about how do they create a data experience. I also have an ulterior motive, which is I happen to love my profession. I think many people have very fond experiences with libraries and with this idea of the world's knowledge and literature. And librarians do, many of them live at the front lines of censorship and data and information literacy and freedom of speech. And so, but I think one of the things that people don't realize is that that librarianship is actually grounded in many foundational thinkers about, the, theoretical problem of how do you catalog the world's knowledge? How does the Library of Congress decide? And I mentioned it earlier, how does the Library of Congress decide, in the 60s, all this literature about feminism ended up in home economics, because there just wasn't a Library of Congress number to put it in yet, ironically. And so as the world changes, the taxonomy it doesn't live there anymore, but you might find some really early literature under the home economics, which is, 210 or something like that. And so that idea of evolving with knowledge and the idea of information as augmenting human intelligence and computing and the internet, what does it mean to remove the burden of, the daily slog to find what you need in order to get your job done, to augment that in a way that gets people sort of past that early burden and off doing the next level of work. There are a lot of early thinkers about that, folks who were involved in the early days of designing hyperlinks and the mouse for computers and stuff. And so I think my profession has a lot to offer the data profession.
Yeah. I mean, this idea that there sort of is a virtuous feedback loop potentially between sort of the consumption of information and the description of information.
Yes.
Seems to be the core theme.
And to think ethically about not introducing bias, to think ethically about responding and evolving and recognizing, as you mentioned before, not to be rigid, but that it's a living, breathing thing in the same way that knowledge is.
Right. Well, I mean, that bias question is almost its own entire episode, and so we'll have to come back to that at some point. But Deb, it's been a huge pleasure. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for spending it with me, Satyen. It was a lot of fun.